Dí Recorda. I was delighted to host a special event here in the European Parliament this morning on space strategy and especially Ireland's role therein. And I was delighted to be joined by experts, especially from UCD and CIT, because we need to feed into what's happening here in Europe. We are developing a space strategy now for the next 7 to 10 years, and the funding streams which will go with that. And of course, we need to have the input of experts to ensure that we do that right. The regulation will stand for a number of years, so it's important that it is broadly based and that it ensures that we can make progress both at the European level but also on the global level, because the space is becoming more and more local in some respects. It has many solutions that we wouldn't have thought of up until now. And I think from an Irish point of view, we are really, I think, now getting to grips with the opportunities that are there. And of course, we look forward to developing our white paper at national level, which will feed into what's happening in Europe. But we need to involve the stakeholders and to ensure that everything is put in place so that we can actually serve our citizens with solutions which will be of enormous benefit to them in so many ways, but also to avail of the opportunities that will be there, be it space tourism or whatever, into the future. And I was delighted to have experts from UCD here this morning, and especially from CIT, where we have Niall here alongside me, who will now go into a little more detail on the issue. Over to you, Niall.
Thanks, Sean. So I think we're at an interesting moment, both in Europe and in Ireland, in the development of space policy, because actually globally space has changed. And you mentioned emerging countries like Ireland. So traditionally Ireland is a small player in the global space market, but because space is becoming less and less expensive to get involved in, it really starts to become interesting for countries like Ireland, whose investment portfolio is naturally going to be a little bit smaller than some of our European counterparts. But we have certain critical areas that we have invested in, like for example, cyber physical security. This is going to become enormously important in the future of space, because traditionally we've moved data along the surface of the planet through fibers and so on. Increasingly, we're going to move that data through spacecraft. That'll be quicker, it'll be more flexible, it'll be cheaper, but we also need to be sure that it's secure. So yes, as an emerging space country, Ireland can use what we're already good at on the ground and transfer that into the space domain. So sometimes people will think of it as rockets, and that's where you really have to get invested in and involved in. Well, rockets are important, of course, but other countries do that really well. So it's about countries looking at what can we do that we already maybe do really well and transfer into the space domain. So this white paper that you mentioned, a space strategy for enterprise that Ireland is developing, this is really important because it's the first time that Ireland has a formal space policy that will connect with the European policies as they're developed, so that we can work in a coordinated fashion. And we've done that in other domains very well in the past. I think now is the time for Ireland really to take the opportunity to do that in the space domain. We've matured with our technology, we've matured with our policies, and there are business models, for example, the likes you mentioned of space tourism, but also potentially areas such as broadband delivery, where we see other countries now looking at this. We need to look at what role can satellites play in what are societal challenges. And I think that's a key point here for me and for the discussion we had this morning, which was really good, which is that there is a societal impact that we need to look after. Our citizens need certain things. They can only be provided realistically in the future through space. But it's now we need to do it, because we need to keep a competitive advantage where we have it, or develop a competitive advantage where we see an opportunity, because other countries and other states will do that. And history shows that it's good to be able to be at the forefront of these technologies rather than just an end user. If you're an end user, you don't get to drive the conversation in the same way as if you're involved from the outset. So I think there's a really important moment for us here.
Yeah, and that's hugely important for us because, as you said, space now is no longer something way out there. It's something really relevant to people's lives, and it can give solutions to societal problems. And that means then that at European level, when we're developing our programs in relation to Horizon Europe, and InvestEU, that actually space can give us the solutions that we're looking for. So we need to enable the funding for the likes of what you're doing in CIT and they're doing in UCD, so that they can get the solutions as quickly as possible. But without the funding, you can't go anywhere.
No, you can, and funding is crucial. Sometimes people think, oh, you're just going to look for funding and so on. In this instance, the return, the impact from a relatively modest amount of funding investment is enormous. And it's enormous because the space domain is no longer this ultra expensive domain to be in. It's now become a domain which is relatively inexpensive for the impact that you get from the investment in it. And I think this is part of the thinking that we need to realize. You know, we think about going to Mars, we think about maybe the International Space Station, which is fantastic in what it does, but we're talking about putting up satellites which are, you know, this size, which can do things which satellites the size of a car or a truck would do 10 years ago. And that's only going to get more and more smaller in terms of satellite size, more impressive. We're seeing, instead of launching single satellites, we're launching tens or hundreds of satellites from one launch vehicle alone. 10 years ago, you and me could not have had this conversation.
That's correct.
So if we don't plan now for something and give the flexibility into the future and have the funding to underline that now, I think we're going to regret that. So I think we also need to talk to colleagues in other disciplines and say, you know what, actually there is a solution which you mightn't have thought about, which involves space. So we need to have that interdisciplinary conversation across Europe now, an intercultural and an interdisciplinary conversation. It's a really exciting moment for us. It's a really good time for us to be looking at Horizon Europe actually as the next mechanism for funding R&D, because now we're at that nexus where space is providing solutions that it simply couldn't a few years ago.
And that's where the event today was so important, because we come at a crucial time. As Niall said, we are now at a time when we need to discuss, because in a few years' time it will be too late. We're having the regulations going through Parliament, so this is perfect. So I really appreciated everybody coming here this morning. Thanks Declan and Emer for organising, and my own staff, and I think this is going to lead to big things into the future. Ramahogif.
Thank you, Shao.